I'd now like to introduce you to Robert Oxoby, professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Calgary, and Allan Undheim. He's the Vice President of Community Building and Investment with the United Way. Welcome.
Hi. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I don't know about you guys, but this is the first time I've had to stand up in a second. So if anybody wants to stand up, go ahead. It's totally worth doing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my work, and different from Alex and Kath, I'm an economist by training. And so I'm going to focus a little bit more on the economics of things. I do experiments, and so I'll talk a little bit about some of my experiments. I grew up in San Francisco, and if you grow up in the States, there's this classic book you read called Invisible Man, and it's not about a guy who disappears, it's by Ralph Ellison, and it's kind of one of the classic books of American literature. And it really is this devastating take on growing up African American in the States in the in the post-World War II era. And this book is, what's so telling about this book is the main character has all these opportunities that come his way. And none of them come to fruition. And he's discriminated against. There's a whole, it's not his fault in some ways. It's worth the read. But it's this really devastating story of when this guy's, using the language we've been talking about here, when this guy's social or personal identity doesn't mesh with all these opportunities that come his way. And we can see this type of effect this type of loss, or this type of identity conflict, if you will, with resources in a bunch of marginalized or disadvantaged groups across Alberta, across Canada, across the world. So what I want to do is talk a little bit, sorry, I got to grab my glasses. I have these new glasses. They're giving me a headache. I hate them. But anyways, part of this thinking about the relationship between identity and resources and opportunities falls under the rubric of ideas of social inclusion or social exclusion or social cohesion. And there was this big study in Europe where they really looked, their primary focus, their largest focus was on immigrant groups coming to Europe, particularly from Asia and Africa. And they were looking at what it is that stops these people from integrating or from taking advantage of resources that are available. And they identify 3 characteristics that fit with social exclusion. One of them is relativity, that individuals are either included or excluded relative to another group. The other is agency, that the inclusion comes to an individual through acts of others, and dynamics, that there's this, individuals are included because of a current state, but also perceptions about what the future holds for them. If you think about what Alex and Kath have been talking about, these are all aspects of social identity. And in some sense, the real shame in this big European study is that they looked at all this stuff and they tried to manipulate resources and programs to try to address each of these 3 things without identifying the fundamental theme that runs through all of them, which is that you feel excluded or included based on the social groups in which you interact and what you perceive those groups to be doing in the future and how you perceive things to be changed, which is fundamentally a question of how you perceive yourself and what your identity is. So basically what they did is they kind of focused on providing people access to rights and resources, removing obstacles to social institutions and and economic institutions, implementing different anti-discrimination laws, implementing different immigration programs, fast-tracking work permits and things like that, without fundamentally addressing the social institution in which all these people were interacting. And so this whole approach kind of makes you think about the aspects of social identity. So how do you define your place within a society? How do you consider your role within the larger community? And what norms of behaviors or expectations do you identify with and that motivate your behavior? So I want to put forth kind of an economic framework for thinking about these ideas, which relies on the role of social identities or of identity in general. And then I want to look at two experiments that we've done out of the University of Calgary. So everyone here taking an economics course? Okay, even if you haven't, what's the one thing you remember about academic economics? There we go, supply and demand, right? 50 years after any course, that's the one thing that everyone remembers. It's an L and an X, and somehow it manifests itself in like the economy working and unemployment and interest rates. Everything can be explained by that graph. That's the kind of traditional economic approach, right? And what that approach is based on fundamentally is that there are these goods, the stuff, the widgets, the iPhones, the cars, and all that stuff we buy, and that they have these characteristics, right? The iPhone is different from the BlackBerry, which is different from some other phone. I don't know, I just have an iPhone. And they provide us utility, and that's why we buy them, and that's where we get supply and demand. Amartya Sen, who is a famous economist, came up with the idea of really kind of redefining that and thinking about what really happens is that these commodities provide capabilities. They provide opportunities for us to do things, and that's what gives us utility or welfare. So a car provides you a means for transportation. A Jag may be nicer than a VW, a 78 VW bus to some people, but it provides a means for transportation, and that capability is what's important. Education provides a capability for skill acquisition, and if you acquire skills, then you can do better in the job market. So it's the capability that matters. Similarly, and relevant to one of the things I'm going to talk about, banks and financial institutions, you can think about those as providing commodities, services, whatever. They provide a capability to transfer money, to borrow, to save, to plan for the future, things like that. Now, if we expand that a little bit, thinking about kind of the work that's been done in behavioral economics, which is kind of incorporating some ideas from psychology, we have, people have endowments, or there are policies out there in which we interact. They provide us with certain commodities. Those commodities provide capabilities. And then there's this interaction, but this is kind of what behavioral economists talk about. There's this interaction between what our cognitions are, what we think about the capabilities, and what our expectations might be for those capabilities, and our actions. And then those actions provide utility and welfare. Good so far? Have I lost anybody? All right. I'm trying to get us back on schedule. So what's the role of social identity? Social identity fundamentally affects the way we think about those capabilities. Social identity fundamentally affects the way we think about the resources that are available to us. So if I identify with a group that disparages post-secondary education, then my identity stops me from realizing the capabilities that are associated with post-secondary education. If I belong to a group of, if I socially identify with a group that is unbanked, that doesn't have bank accounts, doesn't use the traditional financial systems that we're all using, and are using payday lenders or pawn shops or things like that, then providing low-interest loans for housing and things like that, our identity stops us from realizing the capabilities associated with that. And that's fundamentally, if you think about kind of a neoclassical, well, that doesn't help, but if you kind of think about the academic economic stuff, the supply and demand story that we all kind of know, that's really where that fails, because we're not capturing this idea of how we perceive all these capabilities that come available to us. So, if you look at with the type of approaches that policies we think about that promote inclusion or mitigate exclusion, we think about providing job opportunities. We think about providing health services. We think about providing low-income housing. We think about providing social protection to marginalized or disadvantaged groups. We think about providing education and skill upgrading and all sorts of training opportunities. So the emphasis here has been fundamentally on thinking about the supply side, right? That's going to be the upward sloping curve in that little supply and demand picture, which is, encouraging people to join the labor market, to move into the labor market, to get better skills, things like that, to improve their health through services. And the demand side, by removing employer-perceived obstacles, right? So I may have, I may be discriminating against a marginalized group. I can put in legal things to stop that. I can put in, education to try to prevent that, which is affecting the demand side. That's going to be that's going to be the downward sloping one for everyone. So what I want to do, right, but what's neglected here is the aspect of how people access these resources and how people consider these resources. So in the 5 minutes I got left, let me talk about 2 studies we've done and think about them a little bit from the social identity standpoint. So we did some studies with the Autism Societies in Calgary and Edmonton. We also did some studies with a group called, an organization called Momentum in Calgary, which does match savings and financial literacy programs. Let me talk about the autism one. Let me just dump all this up there. There we go. So what we did is we did a survey study of members of the Calgary Autism and Edmonton Autism Societies. And what we were looking for was how they accessed resources and their perceptions of symptom severity in their children. My son has autism, it's quite severe autism, and so that's kind of where my interest comes from. And the one thing when you go through and you look at, we asked them all sorts of questions. The one thing, and one of those things was, what do their social networks and what do their social groups look like, and what groups do they belong to, and who do they identify with? Every parent with autism identifies with every other parent with autism. And you go, oh, great. That's the first step in getting people to access resources. The problem is they don't. And the devastating thing is that there are a lot, Alberta, if you have a child with autism, of all the gin joints in all the world, Alberta is the place to be. It has the highest level of resources. It has the most kind of advanced social programs for children with autism. It's incredible. Unfortunately, those parents they don't take advantage of any of them. And what you look is, if the parents identify with the organizations, they have a greater awareness of available resources. They have greater information, and they're service resources. So I'm talking there about therapeutic type of resources or community engagement resources. They have greater information regarding the financial resources that are available to parents of children with disabilities. And they have greater information regarding the community events that go out there, which include not only things of, like the community swim for children with autism and other disabilities, but also parent support networks and groups like that. The interesting thing is that those groups, as they identify with the Autism Associations, they also report lower levels of family stress for any given level of symptom severity. Which, having a child with autism, it's a stress. Being a parent's a tough job. Being a parent with is a stressful job, and it's just a different level of stress. They're equally stressful, but it's stressful. And what you see is that this, having this knowledge or identification with the community association significantly reduces that, independent of any type of, independent of symptom severity. And when we think about the effect of this, I'm going to go over time. When I'm talking about the financial resources here, people who don't identify with their autism association are, they're much less likely to know about RDSPs, so Registered Disability Savings Plans, which only have a take-up of about 12%. They don't know, they're much less likely to know about the disability tax credit, which is about 10 grand that has a take-up of less than 50%. So these are massive chunks of financial resources that are available that people don't take advantage of in the autism community. We did a secondary study with this, and what we looked at is, can we motivate identification with the autism community or with the Autism Associations? And this is kind of like setting up a bit of a buddy system with somebody who's in the organization for parents with newly diagnosed children or parents who are just not involved with the organization. And what we find is that 1 year later, once we've got them to kind of identify with the organization, they report lower levels of stress. They are much more aware of the financial and service resources. And they have a much higher degree of in-home therapy, which is really by family members, which is really continuing the therapy program you have with children with autism, continuing that when the therapist leaves the room. So the families are much more likely to keep that type of therapy program going, which is really fundamental to trying to provide these children with independent living skills and other types of skills. Let me talk briefly, in the second I have left, about our study with Momentum. So Momentum provides match savings programs and financial literacy programs for people living in for families living in poverty. It's specifically looking at families. And the idea is that these resources through these match savings programs, which vary from 2 to 1 to 5 to 1 depending on the program you're in, are used for skill upgrading, starting a business, and in some cases, purchasing a home. And these are families that are living, just kind of the qualifying thing here is these are families living at 50% or less than the low income cutoff. So these are significant, people living in significant poverty. Our survey evidence there, and we've done a bit of experimenting, that the financial literacy programs, they kind of do what you expect them to do. They result in lower levels of subjective discounting, so people think about the future much more. They are much better at thinking of, planning for future and thinking about what budgeting and things like that involves. The successful participants are much more likely to have a greater sense of control. But the big thing here is that for these programs to be effective, what we've noticed is that the most successful participants have a fundamental change in their identity. They identify themselves differently, as a part of a different group and part of a group that plans for the future. I don't know about you guys, but when I was 20 years old and knew everything, I didn't think about the future. I didn't think, my primary financial thing was I had a checking account and I had a pawn shop near my house, and that's how, that was my financial planning through my late teens and mid 20s. What do you do? But I still knew everything. But that change from moving from unbanked to banked to thinking about retirement savings to thinking about home purchase requires a fundamental change in identity. And that's the thing we've noticed with Momentum is that financial literacy is great. People can think about balancing a checkbook. They can know how a savings account works. They know how an annuity works. They retain that information much more. We observe much more behavioral change if their identity changes, and those become things that are salient in their new identity. Those become norms that are relevant to them. Let me just end with a couple closing comments, but the short of the whole thing is that when we think about new policies and program uptake and things like that, we have to take into account the identity that people enter these things with. If we don't, we can provide all sorts of resources to marginalized, disadvantaged groups, advantaged groups, whatever, but they're not going to take advantage of those unless we can provide a means for their identity to internalize the different norms of behavior that come with those resources. And I think that would be the thing to consider as we consider program design, as we consider policy development, that thinking about what it is that, how do we get people to internalize these norms? How do we get people to identify with the fundamental changes we're trying to facilitate through resource allocation or through policy design? Thanks a lot.
Last but not least, thank you, Professor Oxoby. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm going to respond to Professor Oxoby's presentation, but it's It's been enlightening in some respects as well. I mean, I have a close friend who was a university roommate who moved to Sydney, which is not too far from where you are, and he developed manic depression. And so I have conversations with him from time to time, the old-fashioned way, by phone, and he tells me all the time about these groups he's involved with. And of course, he's working with a doctor. He sometimes has to pay visits to the hospital for periods of time. But it just occurred to me that these are likely being prescribed as part of his ability to cope with his ailment. So very interesting from that perspective. So I want to share a story about my 9-year-old daughter, and this sort of came to light. This was a conversation I had with her probably about a month and a half ago. And as I was preparing for this, I thought, wait a minute, I recall that discussion. She was just telling me about her day at school, just the usual conversations, and she was telling me about something that happened on the playground. There was a little girl in her class that really wanted to play with a group of girls. And she went over to that group of girls and asked, hey, can I join in? And they said no. Now, I can't believe already in grade 4 that sort of thing happens, but it does. And so this had apparently happened before. And so my daughter, being the kind of kid she is, went and invited this girl to come join her group. And the girl, said no. And so now my daughter is kind of freaked out and saying, well, how could that be? I have extended an invitation for her to come be part of our group. And this girl said no. So we had a bit of a conversation about that. And I thought, well, maybe she's scared. Maybe her experience has not been positive in the past. Maybe she's afraid to go join your group because of fear. Could be. Anyway, so, and while the world and its challenges may be a little more complex than the playground at a grade 4 school, their story is still, I think, quite illustrative. And to that little girl who was excluded, there's no doubt that that moment and previous moments had an impact on her identity and has shaped her way of thinking. So she may not have the capability, for instance, to interact with a healthy group without some persistence on behalf of others to make that happen. So structurally in the social service sector, for those who are most vulnerable, we exclude. We exclude people. We don't intentionally do it, but we do. And there could be a variety of circumstances behind why we exclude. Why we don't build on the capabilities of individuals who may be able to connect in and access services. And so there are a variety of reasons. There's the structural, there's things like transportation, childcare, housing. I mean, we've talked about all of them already. We've heard about them all. There's stigma, isolation, racism, discrimination, language barriers, you name it. There's a whole array. And while there are some who, against all odds, still manage to associate with a healthy group, still manage to connect in with the appropriate program or service that will provide for them what they need, many don't. And they may be just like that little girl. They may have had experiences over time that have compromised their capability to intersect with healthy groups, that will forge a positive social identity that will give them the capability to change their circumstances for the better. And of course, they give up. They may seek isolation because ultimately that's less painful. So by them making that decision, of course, we as society, we judge. Your one PowerPoint slide showing the homeless man, we as society judge all the time. We might label them as lazy. We create stories about them, about how they got there, about why they're there currently, and also, as you mentioned, how we also infer their potential to be something different in the future. And and as a sector, we all try very hard. We try to do the right thing. We don't want any of this to happen. We want to engage everyone who needs support and provide that support. And we want to create lasting, meaningful change for people. There's a growing intolerance, and this is a good thing, for managing issues, and a desire to start trying to think creatively about changing things permanently for people. I recall a conversation back when Franca was part of our group here in Edmonton with our funded partners. And I remember the conversation about, there was a number of excellent organizations sitting around the table talking about how there's a lot of good stuff happening in the community, and we're all doing great work. But the stats, whatever stat you want to point to, whether it's poverty, homelessness, mental health, whatever, high school completion rates, you name it, the stats aren't changing. We're not moving the needle. So how can we work differently? How can we come at things differently? I mean, there are those who have some capability and who just need a nudge, and they will have the ability to benefit from programs and services, know how to access them first of all, and have the ability to benefit and to change for the better and change permanently. But for those most vulnerable, how do we move the needle for them? How do we get at some of those statistics? And so 10 years from now, we see significant improvement. That's the question. And so that was a question that Franco and others in that room posed as a group, just trying to figure out, in terms of our group, what's our role in this? What can we do to problem solve it? So that challenged us as an organization, as a united way, to try to figure out, okay, what stake can we put in the sand? I mean, we've generally been about everybody and everything. We ultimately landed on poverty as a mission for us, and we created a framework around that. But through that process, we had a number of consultations with our partners. And we asked them, look, the sector is what it is. It's kind of evolved to be what it is. Our city has changed, our region has changed. If we could, park it all and say, okay, the city is what it is. Now how can we create a social service infrastructure that will support people in a meaningful way where they're at? If we could draw it up differently, what would it look like? And through great conversation, essentially three themes emerged. One, person-centered. Services programs need to be person-centered. We need to meet the person from where they're at. And often the ability to access that individual is through an existing association or group, some affinity they currently have, where there's trust, where there's an identity built, there's the ability to leverage that to be able to create meaningful, lasting change. It is challenging as an individual, especially maybe a new individual, to navigate a system of services, to be able to find what you need when you need it. And so system navigation was certainly a theme, and the person-centered approach was a way of helping with that. One door is the right door, and from that point of view, with whatever association or group that is, we can then wrap ourselves around that individual and assist them in whatever way is required. No one issue works in isolation. It's always a complex mixture of issues that impact a person's life and ability to change. So person-centered was certainly one. Another was place-based. So we have a system that currently is very centralized in most cases, but when we look at the city, we have, I think over the last couple of years, we had about 60,000 new people move into the region, the Alberta capital region. That's a lot of people through migration, immigration, through some population growth, but significant numbers. And they're all moving downtown where the services are. They're moving out into the outlying areas. They're moving to where housing is affordable. Of course, that is one of the areas that is a barrier. And so what can we as a sector do to ensure we are there where they are at? That is where their associations are, hopefully. That's where their connections could be in their neighborhoods. The structural barriers around transportation can be mitigated by having supports and services in place in those areas. Now, of course, the costs of doing that are astronomical. And the bricks and mortar of organizations and programs and services don't need to be in every neighborhood in every part of the city. But at the same time, the capability of the sector to be able to meet people where they're at and intersect with their groups and their associations in their neighborhoods was seen as pivotal. And then the third piece was shared leadership. It is not just the purview of the social service sector to be able to create lasting change that would ultimately move the needle on social issues, or various departments or ministries within various levels of government. It's not just that part of our society that needs to care. It's the private sector. It's individuals all over. We do not change anything unless everyone is certainly rowing in the same direction. So, we have seen, and make no mistake, there are a lot of great examples, too many to go into in the time that I have left, which I probably don't have any time left. There are many extraordinary examples out there of this happening, of initiatives where companies, social service organizations, various levels of government, foundations, individuals are all participating collectively around trying to address an issue, maybe in a specific initiative. But it's happening. We just need it to happen more. We need to scale up. There needs to be more of it, and that's already been said, and I would certainly echo that sentiment. Now, just, it's interesting. I have somebody close to me who struggles with alcoholism, and so I've done a bit of reading on this, and I did this the old-fashioned way. I read it, and I didn't have access to a computer. or a printer, so I wrote it out, a quote from this, how archaic, right? But anyway, it was a blog that I was reading in the Huffington Post by a fellow by the name of Johan Hari. And he was traveling the world trying to find some sort of solution to the addictions, because people in his life were also struggling with addictions of all sorts. And so when I read it, it just sort of struck me that it kind of describes a little bit about what we're talking about here today. So I'm just going to read from this. The writer George Monbiot has called this the age of loneliness. We have created human societies where it is easier for people to become cut off from all human connections than ever before. Bruce Alexander, and he's an author and a researcher, told me that for too long we have talked exclusively about individual recovery from addiction, or insert whatever issue you would like. We need to talk about societal recovery, how we all recover together from the sickness of isolation that is sinking us like a thick fog. Loving an addict is really hard. When I looked at the addicts I love, it is always tempting to follow the tough love advice doled out by reality shows like Intervention. Tell the addict to shape up and cut them off. Their message is that an addict who can't stop should be shunned. But, in fact, I have learned that approach will only deepen their addiction, and you may lose them altogether. I came home determined to tie the addicts in my life closer to me than ever, to let them know I love them unconditionally, whether they stop or whether they can't. I think it's an important message. Now back to my daughter, the persistent one. The very next day, after being shunned, told no, how dare she? She went up to this little girl once again, the very next day, and invited her to be part of her group. And she said yes, so she was very happy about that. It turns out that complex social issues in grade 4 can be solved in one day, so we can learn something from it. It may take us a little longer, but certainly we need to persist, and we need to try to continue to leverage the capabilities, the groups, the associations that others are currently engaged with, and be able to bring services and supports to them in that fashion. Thank you.